So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar series. Today we will have a very interesting webinar on evaluation and complexity in the SDGs era. Our presenter is Michael Bamberger that will be introduced by the moderator. Before we proceed, I would like to share with you some rules of the game that are important for the webinar to go well. First, we need everybody to mute their mics. There is an icon at the bottom of the screen. The second one looks like a mic. The first one is the camera, the second one looks like a mic. You have to click there in order to mute your mic. That will allow us not to have background noise. Thank you very, very much. There are a few that still need to do that. Now, we have sent yesterday a checklist that Michael has put together, and he is asking participants to see the checklist and to see whether it works and to provide inputs. We will receive the inputs in the following way. For those UNICEF colleagues, please send your inputs to Logmore or Celeste. For those who are external to UNICEF, send your inputs to Ada Ocampo, AOCAMPO @unicef.org. You have been receiving my email, so it will be easy for you to recognize my name and send the inputs to me. We will collect and we will compile them and send them to Michael. Michael has advised us that if you feel comfortable asking questions or making comments in a different language than English, he will accept comments or questions in Spanish, French, or Portuguese. However, it's important to take into account that this webinar is in English, so therefore if you feel comfortable, we depart from the assumption that you understand English, therefore the responses will be in English. We have today a moderator and a discussant. Our moderator is our dear colleague Florence Eta. Florence Eta is an award-winning evaluator from the American Evaluation Association Years Award in 2012. She has been a core member of the Paris Declaration Phase 2. She is currently a member of the management group of EVAL SDGs, who is the co-organizer of this webinar. Florence has done consultancies for many organizations, including IDRC, UNICEF, USAID, Rockefeller Ford Foundation, and others. She contributed to the growth of the Africa and Gender Development Evaluation Network, ACDEN, and which is one of the foremost associations committed to gender responsive and human rights sensitive evaluation. She is very active in EVAL SDGs. It will be very long to really acknowledge all the achievements and engagement on different fronts that Florence deserves, but I will end up there. And I will just mention that she is married and has 4 children. Thank you very much, Florence. We also have a discussant today. Our discussant today is Dorothy Lux. Dorothy is the co-chair, together with me, of EVAL SDGs. Dorothy is passionate about sustainable development, which prompted her involvement as co-chair of EVAL SDGs Network, an initiative of EVAL Partners and UNEC and the UN, which aims to provide a platform for collaboration and advocacy around the evaluation of the SDGs. Dorothy is the executive director of SDF Global, a social enterprise with a focus on sustainable development. She has been working internationally as an evaluator and as a strategic advisor for a range of United Nations organizations, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, for over 25 years. She also works for the private sector, government, and non-profit programs in Australia across a range of sectors. We really welcome and thank you, Dorothy, for her passion and commitment and for always being available to contribute. On behalf of UNICEF and Eval SDGs, we welcome you all to this webinar, and I will pass over to our moderator, Flor Enzeta, who will moderate the session and will also introduce Michael Bamberger. Florence, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ada. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Fantastic. Fantastic. Let me join Ada in welcoming all of you for joining. And we're sorry for some of the technical hitches that you're already experiencing. We'll try as much as we can to resolve them as we go. I'd like to start by thanking Ada for the gracious introductions of me and Dorothy. And you know, the funny thing is, Michael, perhaps for many of you, does not need any introduction. And what interests me is the fact that when you ask icons, Michael is one of our icons in evaluation, development evaluation, clearly, as you all know, currently. When we asked Michael to give us a small bio brief, it was so small that I was totally intrigued by it. You know, people who have tomes about themselves, who have tomes to be written about themselves, when they're asked to talk about themselves, are usually very, very modest, which is what I find in Michael. He has a sociology from the London School of Economics, which he shares with my dear husband. And he has been involved in evaluation of development in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America for over 40 years. He has worked on poverty, social exclusion, gender equality, women's empowerment, and urban development. For those of you who have had the benefit of being taught by him, he has also written extensively. Okay, he has written extensively on how to conduct sound evaluations in real world contexts. Over the past couple of years, he has worked on the opportunities and challenges for integrating new ICTs into the evaluation of development programs. His recent publications include dealing with complexity in the evaluation of development programs, integrating big data, that's a good one. I was fortunate to be with him at the last Africa conference where he gave us some of his insights on using big data in evaluation of development programs. He also has a publication on real-world evaluation, talking about working under budget, time, data, and political constraints. And of course, he has evaluating the social development goals through equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations, which is where we intersect with Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the icon we're going to listen to today. But before I hand over the floor or the space to Michael, let me explain a little bit about the structure of this webinar. We have a little over 1 hour. We're hoping to work around 1 hour 15, 1 hour 20 minutes max. And we structure the time into five or six sections. Michael will speak for three sections, basically interspersed equally. After Michael finishes, each of the sections will be followed very, very briefly with questions of clarity. And then when he finishes his three sections, we will have Dorothy give us her own take. Dorothy will be the discussant. She'll tell us what she has gleaned from the presentation, and she will bring into the space, because she too has worked in complexity, bring into this space her own thoughts around what Michael is sharing. After that, that's the fourth section. The fifth one would have participant questions, and finally we will close. As we close, if there's still time, we can have informal conversations to continue. But let me just reiterate a little bit of what Ada had said, for those of you who had not joined us. One is that there will be questions, and Michael has graciously agreed to take questions in English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, but he will respond in English. We also have the chat bar, which is open. You can put in your questions there for those of you who can. And finally, Michael has requested Sorry, Michael has asked us to graciously send inputs, questions.
How many bedrooms? It's not 2 bedroom.
Sorry, is there somebody?
I'm sorry, is there someone talking while
Mariam, can you please mute your mic?
Thank you.
Mariam Abdu.
This one?
Mariam?
My brother has plenty of millions. Is almost 140 something million, 40 something, yes. Yes. How many? No, wait a minute. $1,000 is how much?
Can you
disconnect? Million, isn't it?
Can I go on? What shall we do?
Okay, multiply.
There. Okay, continue.
Okay, good, fantastic. So I just wanted to say last point that Michael has asked if we have inputs and for the checklist, which he's going to present, to send our inputs to Ada from those of us who are not within UNICEF and those who are in UNICEF to send their comments or inputs to Lovemore. I have the distinct pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce you or hand you over to Michael Bamberger. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Many of my friends are listening in today, so it's a pleasure to be in touch with you again, and thank you very much for the gracious introduction. Next slide, please. What I'm going to be trying to do in this session in about...
Hi, Karush, I hear you, but I don't see the link.
Is to talk about four main topics to help demystify what we mean by complexity and how it can be used in the real world for evaluating development programs and particularly for evaluating the SDGs. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the importance of complexity for development evaluation, and then the second part, what I call demystifying complexity, to show everybody we already understand a lot about complexity.
Hi,
and
Karush,
it's something which
I hear you, but I don't see any link.
It has to be thought about carefully, but it's something which we're already more familiar with than we expect. And then we'll have a break for questions, and then the third topic will be how one can measure complexity using the checklist which we've shared with you. And then the fourth step will be introducing a strategy, a 5-step strategy for actually evaluating complex programs. And then we'll have questions and discussion. And then towards the end, when Florence tells me, I'll just do the final slide, which is introducing issues of complexity in the SDGs, which is what we'll be covering in the second webinar, I think sometime within the next 2 months. So I hope you'll find this interesting, and I'm looking forward very much to your ideas and comments. So next slide, please. So we're going to begin with very briefly talking about why complexity is important for development evaluation. So next, please. Complexity is becoming increasingly important in development evaluation for a number of reasons. The first is that we're moving towards more complex development interventions. They're bigger, they involve more agencies, often they have more components, often they cover larger areas, so it becomes more challenging to evaluate these growing and increasingly complex programs with standard evaluation methods. Also, stakeholders are becoming more demanding. They're expecting more from evaluation. They believe evaluators can do more, can provide them with more information. So there's more pressure on evaluators to deliver on a broader range of questions. Then I'll be talking briefly towards the end that there's lots of very exciting developments with big data, which provides the possibility to conduct kinds of complexity analysis which was not previously possible. and we'll just be talking about that briefly towards the end. So you can see there's a number of reasons why complexity is becoming increasingly important in development evaluation. So next, at the same time, evaluators are recognizing the limitations of their conventional evaluation methods. The main issue is that most evaluations, conventional evaluations, are designed to assess relatively simple causal analysis models where there's a limited number of inputs trying to produce a limited number of outputs, and there's a fairly direct causal chain between the inputs and the outcomes. Now, when we get into complexity, this doesn't work, which is one of the reasons we needed a new kind of complex responsive evaluation. Then there's a number of aspects of these complex programs which are difficult to assess using conventional methods. Firstly, we'll be talking a lot about emergence and emergent designs. Programs keep changing, the participants keep changing, the context keeps changing, so a pre-test, post-test comparison design, which we are all familiar with, doesn't work very well if what you're evaluating is completely continually changing. Then we're also working with multi-sector programs, which are hard to evaluate with conventional methods. And as we'll see, there's also complex interactions between different stakeholders and organizations, which is something which is often ignored, but is very important for evaluation. And then there are many external contextual factors which also affect programs: the political environment, the economic environment, migration, emergencies. All of these things are affecting the program and need to be captured. And then finally, a lot of the things we're looking at are behavioral change. It's not just whether more kids go to school, more people use water. Attitudes are changing, behavior, how people use water, for example, are changing. These are dynamic and difficult to capture with the conventional methods. So again, we need a new set of evaluation methods. So next, please. So in this second section, I'm going to be talking briefly about demystifying complexity. So I hope at the end of this session we'll all have a reasonably clear idea of some of the basic ideas of complexity. So next. So here we have a complexity map which identifies 4 dimensions of complexity, which we'll be discussing. The first is the intervention itself, the program we're studying. This can either be simple or it can be complex, and we'll be discussing that. Also, there are institutions and stakeholders which have complex interactions among themselves, and which can be, again, difficult to measure. Often there's competition between stakeholders. They have different systems which don't work very well together. So this is another dimension of complexity. And then there's the system within which the programs operate. We mentioned the economic, political, environmental, demographic factors, all of which are influencing the program. And then finally, there's the processes of causality and change, which I'll be just showing you in a minute, are not linear. So these also can be more complex and challenging to evaluate. So next slide, please. So one thing which you might like to put on your office wall when you're thinking about complexity evaluations is the concept of emergence. This is basically saying everything is changing. The political environment is changing, the government changes, the context in which a program operates is changing, the communities change, their attitudes to the program change, and the programs themselves often are modified significantly. So we're working in a very dynamic environment where everything is changing, and so a nice pre-test, post-test comparison doesn't work very well. So next, please. This is just an example of the traditional simple linear causal chain where you have one input and you're looking at its effect on one outcome, and there are some intervening variables. This is a model which we're familiar with and which works well for simple programs. But next slide, please. This is what a complex causal chain looks like. There are many inputs on the left. There are many outcomes and impacts on the right. And there are many, many intervening variables, these little blue circles. Now, the critical thing about this is it's not that there are just lots of inputs and lots of outcomes, but also if you look carefully, you see that there are lots of different arrows going to each of the outcomes. So in a complex environment, a particular outcome can be produced by a number of different combinations of inputs. So this again is something which a conventional evaluation really finds it very, very difficult to handle. So you can see that if you're working with a complex causal chain, you really do need to have some evaluation methods which can capture these dynamic relationships, the emergence, the very complex relationships between the inputs and outcomes. So that very briefly is initial ideas on what we mean by complexity. I'm going to take a break in a minute and ask for any comments or thoughts you have on this initial framework, and then we will go on to talk about how you can measure complexity using the checklist which you have, and then an introduction to an approach for evaluating complex programs. Then we'll have comments and discussion, and then towards the end, I will just give the final slide, which is highlighting some of the complexity issues in the SDGs. So we'll take a break now, and if you have any questions or comments, or if you have examples from your own work of programs which are complex. So thank you. I'll pass you over to Florence.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you particularly for keeping to time in relation to the way we had sectioned the architecture for the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be interesting if you have any questions of clarity at this point. And Michael had suggested if you had any ideas, we would say maybe keep those, either put them in the little chat box to the left of your screen, and we would capture them and deal with them, come back to them a little later. Any questions of clarity, things that are unclear, things you didn't see, things you would probably like Michael to clarify a little more. Now, if we don't have those, then we can continue, but we'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Oh, there's a question here, Mike, on the chat box that says, inputs, program inputs only, or all inputs? That's from Patty Hill. That's the only question we have right now on the chat boxes.
Sorry, I didn't quite capture the question. It said inputs, okay, and then something else I didn't quite hear.
Okay, let me take that again. The question says, we really have this, we're looking at the slide now that has inputs, the complex causal chain slide that has inputs and showing the arrows that Chris Harris says looks like a natural neural network. The question that Pat is asking is, are we talking just program inputs or all inputs?
Mike?
Okay, well,
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, there is another question. There is another question. Probably you can take the two together. It says, hi, I was wondering if Michael could explain why pre and post tests don't work. Over.
Okay. Great. So, okay, well, let's take those two questions. They're both very, very good questions. So, on they're related, of course. So on the first question of are we just looking at program inputs? No, we're with complexity, we're looking at all of the 4 dimensions that are mentioned of the external factors, the relationships among all of the stakeholders, as well as looking at the program itself. So what I put there was just a simple model to show that when you're looking at relationships between inputs and outcomes or impacts, it's very much more challenging than if you have a simple evaluation design with a pre-test, post-test comparison. So with complexity, we're looking at a whole range of factors, not just the program input. So I just put that as a simple way to make the contrast with the complex between the complex and the simple program designs. But there's many factors which come in, and one of the exciting things with big data is you can look at a very much larger number of inputs and intervening variables than you could with the conventional evaluation designs. On the question of why the the pre-test, post-test comparison design doesn't work very well, this is the design which most of us are familiar with, where you have a baseline measurement at the beginning of the project to find out, for example, what percentage of girls are going to school before the project begins, or what percentage of people have access to drinking water. And then you come back after the intervention to see what changes have taken place. Are more girls going to school? Are more people drinking safe water? Have infection rates gone down? And ideally, you compare your project with a comparison group which is similar, but which doesn't have access to the project. Then you're looking at whether after the project there is a difference in the proportion of girls going to school in schools in the project compared with schools not in the project, and so on. The problem with the pre-test, post-test design is it assumes that the project remains constant, that the kind of inputs which you are giving at the beginning of the project stay the same throughout the project, and they're still the same after 3 or 4 years. When you do the post-test measurement, you're also assuming that the environment remains relatively similar. You have the same group of people living there as there was at the beginning. You're assuming that there are no major contextual factors, that there's not a famine, there aren't massive migrations, that there isn't a civil war going on. So you're assuming that when you go back to measure 2 or 3 years later, towards the end of the project, the situation is pretty similar. Now, if the program has completely changed, which quite often happens, for example, you may have started just with providing school breakfast to get girls to go to school, then you may find that you also needed to include transport, that there are problems that girls don't like walking to school through the village because the boys tease them, and so you may have to arrange for the children to walk to school in groups, or you give some kind of orientation to the village leaders to stop the boys teasing the girls. So at the end of the project, what you're measuring may be completely different. So if you're just trying to say, do school breakfast improve school attendance, it may be school attendance has gone up very significantly, but lots of other things have happened. You may be now providing school transport, you may be making the girls feel more comfortable walking through the village. So the pre-test, post-test doesn't work if the program has significantly changed. So this is the basic problem, that the world becomes more complex. The world is, you have emergence, things have changed, so it becomes very difficult to know how to make the comparison. So this is one of the main reasons that we try to use a more complexity-focused evaluation.
Thank you, Michael. I'm not sure that our time would permit us to take any more questions, even though there are quite a number that have been put on the pane. Can I suggest that Michael continues, and at the end you can just restate your questions if you have stated them here, or we can just go on and read through them as we haven't answered all of them. We still have. Michael has only gone through a third of his presentation, probably a quarter only. So I would suggest we hold the questions we have until he finishes at least the second and third sections. Could we do that, please? I don't hear any. Sure, thank you. Great, fantastic. Okay, Michael.
Right. So now, have the next slide, please. This should say the complexity checklist. So now I'm going to introduce the checklist which you have, which is a tool which we're developing for trying to understand and measure the different dimensions of complexity. And as was mentioned at the beginning, UNICEF and Eval SDG are interested in possibly developing some kind of pilot or getting feedback on whether this checklist is useful. So I'll be introducing it today, and then hopefully we'll have another opportunity to discuss it in more detail. So I hope you all have the checklist, because I'm going to be describing it briefly. So next, please. So this again is the complexity map, just to remind you. Next, please. This slide is a little bit difficult to see, but it's reproducing the first part of the checklist which you have. And the basic setup of this checklist is that there's a section for each of the four dimensions of complexity: the intervention, interactions among institutions and stakeholders, the dimensions of causality and change, which we were just been discussing, and the fact that the program is embedded in a system which is affecting how the program operates. So for each of these four dimensions, we're starting to develop indicators which can be used for rating each of the indicators on this 5-point scale. You'll see at the top it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So for each indicator, if you think the level of complexity of the indicator is very low, you'd give a 1. If you thought the level of complexity was very high, you'd give a 5. If it was somewhere in between, you give a 2, 3, or 4, depending on how complex you think it is. So just to see how this works, the first indicator is the objectives of the program. So if the program has very few objectives, and if they're relatively clearly defined, you may feel that complexity on that dimension is very low. Everybody understands what the objectives are. On the other hand, if the program has multiple objectives, if they're very broad, if they're often not defined very clearly, maybe not everybody completely agrees on what the objectives are, then you might decide this has got a high level of complexity when you might give it a score of 4 or 5. So you'll see for the first dimension, the nature of the intervention, there are 10 indicators, and each of these you can rate on this 5-point scale. So you go through, and each indicator you think is this complex, or is it pretty simple, or is it somewhere in the middle? So when you've completed the first part, you'll have a rating for each of the 10 dimensions, and you can then add up those scores to give an approximate estimate of whether the first dimension, the program itself, whether in general it's fairly simple or it's fairly complex. So this is not magical science, but it's giving us a rough idea of whether we think that the program itself is relatively simple or relatively complex. We then do the same for each of the other 3 dimensions. We go through checking each of the indicators and coming up with a score. And so at the end, we will have the 25 scores. One small complication is that for the first dimension, the program, there's a lot more indicators which you really need to capture for that. So there are 10 indicators for the first dimension, and as you'll see, there's only 5 indicators for each of the second, third, and fourth dimensions. So just to keep the balance, the score for the first dimension we divide by 2, so that this means that we will have a maximum score of 25 for each of the 4 dimensions, and a maximum score of 100 if the program was considered completely complex on all of the dimensions. So this is basically what the checklist is: a series of indicators, each of which we rate in terms of its complexity. We add up the scores to get an estimate of the complexity of each of the 4 dimensions, and then if we wish to, we can add the 4 scores together and get some idea of how complex the overall program is. The lowest score you could get for the overall program is 25, and the highest score you can get is 100. So this is basically what the checklist is. It's still at the stage of being developed, and there's hoping we may possibly be cooperating on refining this and testing it out in the field to see whether it works very well. So ways that you can use this checklist, firstly, it can help the management and stakeholders to understand the dimensions of complexity. A lot of people just say this program is very complex or it's not very complex, and they don't really think through what they mean. So here, at least you break it down into 4 dimensions, and when you talk about complexity, are you really talking about the program design is complex? Are you talking about the problems of coordination between the different agencies? Are you talking about the fact that there are external factors which are affecting it? So this helps people to understand what we actually mean by complexity, which is quite important. A lot of discussions, people just say, no, our program's very complex, but they don't really explain what they mean by that. And then operationally, you can decide whether a program is sufficiently complex to justify using a complexity responsive evaluation design, which we're going to be talking about in a minute. And this is important because a complexity design usually takes more time, it's more tricky to implement, and it can be more expensive. So an organization really needs to decide whether a program is sufficiently complex to justify this extra effort. You can also look at all of the programs in your portfolio and compare them all on your complexity scale to see whether you get patterns of some. Is the program itself always relatively simple, but the problems come with the coordination with different stakeholders, or is the main problem the program itself is complex? So you can look across your portfolio and compare the scores for different programs. And then finally, you can compare complexity scores with the assessments of program performance, and you can see whether there's any relationship. Are programs which you rate as being more complex, do they tend to be have lower success on performance scores, or maybe they have higher? But that's interesting to look at. Then the next slide it says, please note, just to remember that this is not a super scientific checklist. It's just beginning to give us an initial indicator, so you can't do fancy regression analysis and factor analysis and so on. It's just giving us a rough estimate of what we mean by complexity. So I'm sure we'll have a number of questions and discussions on this in the discussion time, but a lot of workshops I've given, people have found this checklist is quite useful because it's fairly easy to understand and to apply, and it's also fairly easy to discuss with management. They can understand this because you have a series of very specific questions that you're looking at. So that is the checklist. That was one of the key tools for thinking about complexity. So now I'd like to go on the next slide, please, to a brief introduction to the 5-step methodology for evaluating complex programs, which we call the Unpacking methodology. And with the time we have, I'll only be able to give an introduction to this, but we hopefully will have time to discuss this in a bit more detail in the second seminar when we talk about how to apply complexity to evaluating the SDGs. Next, please. For anybody who's interested, the things we're talking about today are discussed in more detail in the book which I co-authored with 2 colleagues, dealing with complexity in development evaluation. That's available. Unfortunately, it's a commercial book, so you have to buy it, but it's available online or in hard copy. So next, please. This here is an overview of the unpacking, reassembling approach to evaluating complexity. We'll see in a minute why we call it unpacking. So the basic idea here is that we have 5 steps. We begin with doing a mapping exercise to understand the complexity dimensions of the program. Why do we think it's complex? Is it the program itself? Is it the context in which it operates? Is it the relationships between the different stakeholders? So we do a mapping exercise to understand what we mean by complexity for this particular program. And then the key element of this approach, or one of the key elements, is that you can then very often select particular components or elements of this complex program which you can separate out and which you can evaluate individually. Now, if you do that, this simplifies the evaluation, and it has the very big advantage that in step 3, you can now use conventional evaluation approaches for looking at each of these the components which you've decided to evaluate separately. And I'll be talking in just a moment about what kind of components you can look at. So then you do the evaluations of each of the individual components, and the challenge is how to reassemble these to look at the big picture. And this is really critical because there are many evaluations where each of the individual programs components are evaluated positively, but when you put them all together again, the program in the environment in which it's working is not having any significant impact. An example would be if you have a program for addressing violence against women. You may have a program for technical assistance to the police with how to protest complaints of violence. You may be working with community groups to give them more confidence to go and report incidents of violence. You may be working with the schools to change the curriculum to make their kids more aware of gender-based violence issues. You may also have a component working with one of the ministries to introduce new legislation. It very often happens when you evaluate each of these individual components, you find that they've all been rated pretty well. But when you put them all together and you go back to the communities, you can't really see that there's been any reduction in violence against women. Unfortunately, this often happens. So this is an example where if you look at each individual component, you may say we've been really successful. People like the training we did in the schools have introduced new curricula. The police said the assistance we gave them was very helpful. So each of the individual components has gone well. That would be a conventional, simple evaluation. But when you put it all together, you find because of the very complex environment, all of the different influences, that you haven't actually had any detectable impact on your overall goal of reducing violence against women in this case. So this is a really critical element, step 4, of reassembling the different components to see when you put it all together, are you having any impact on your broader goals, reducing violence against women, reducing hunger, reducing waterborne infections. And then there's a 5th step where you stand back and you going back to the big picture. It could be that your program has been quite successful in itself, but you're then asking broader questions like how does this relate to the SDGs or a national goal of poverty reduction. So this is the framework. You begin step 1, mapping the program using our checklist. You then break it down into different components, each of which can be evaluated separately. You think what tools could you use for evaluating each component, and then you go through the complicated exercise of reassembling the different components to see when you put it all together, what impacts have you had on your broad goals, and then stepping back even further, what contribution has this made to broad development goals such as the SDGs. So this is very, very simply the overall framework. I'm just going to go through the steps very quickly because of the time, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to go into a bit more detail. So next, please. So this step 1 is summarizing what we're doing. We're mapping the system. We're looking at the intervention, organizational structure, contextual factors, and causality. We then apply the complexity checklist to rate each of these dimensions. And then we ask, is the program sufficiently complex to justify a complexity-focused evaluation? And then is it feasible and affordable? And is there any evidence that you would have a value added if you did use it? And then the green box at the bottom, when we've done the evaluation, we come back and ask about, did the complexity focus make a difference? Did you get more valuable results from the evaluation than if you hadn't used it? On the left, you can also talk about the complexity in the evaluation itself, which I'm not going to get into today. So this is the framework you're thinking about. So the step 1 mapping the system, you can use a number of different approaches: systems analysis, social network analysis, systems dynamics, critical systems heuristics, which some people call defining boundaries. There's a number of different ways that you can map the system. Next, please. We'll jump to the next slide, the one with the chart. This is an example of a very simple systems analysis where you put in the different agencies who are involved. In this case, it was a decentralized transport program, so you have the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Local Government, the communities, and then the blue boxes are the different kind of services which are being provided, and on the right-hand side, the orange circles are the different stages of the evaluation. And you can see here there's a network of arrows connecting the different boxes. These arrows can show which departments are communicating with which agencies, or for example, the community promotion department of the ministry is connecting with communities, and you track the frequency of communications. You can track whether they're in one direction or two directions, whether they're mainly positive or negative or neutral, and so you can map how the system is operating in terms of communication and power structures, and then you can come back periodically to see whether there are changes have taken place. So this is just a very simple example of a systems map, and they can get much more complicated than that. So next, please. And we'll go on to the next and to step 2. So we mentioned that you can select different kinds of units of analysis to look at. So some of the units of analysis which you could evaluate separately, you could look at policy interventions. You could on the broad level, you could look at the how policy interventions have evolved over time. You could look at them vertically. Maybe the policy works well at the national level, but not locally. You can look at it horizontally, how it works in different regions of the country. Or you may decide to use the different components of the program. With the gender-based violence, one component you could look at is the training programs for communities or the technical assistance to the police. So you could look at those components, each of those separately, and do a separate evaluation. You can also look at different elements of your program theory. You could look at all of the inputs or the processes or the outcomes. You could also use cases or variables. So there's a number of different ways that you could identify the components to look at. Next, please. Then once you've identified the components, you can then think about which of the conventional evaluation designs you might use for these components. Experimental designs, theory-based contribution analysis, case studies, any of the evaluation tools you can use for the evaluation, which is one of the attractive things about this system. Next, please. So step 4, you then start reassembling the program, and there's a range of different tools that you could use for this, which are listed here. You'll be getting all of these handouts after the session, so I don't have time to go through those in detail, but there's a whole range of tools that you can use, including things like the comparative case studies, QCA, which a lot of you might have used. You could use systems modeling again, and you can use rating scales. So there's a number of different ways that you can try to put the program together again. And next, please. So finally, when you try to stand back and look at the big picture, some of the factors which you also need to take into account is emergence, which we've talked a little bit about, spillover. The program might be having effects on a wider range of groups than the ones that you were anticipating, or displacement effects, where the benefits are going to different groups than to those that it was originally targeted for. There's also, you need to look at the coordination issues. You need to look at how coherent the policies are that are being implemented. So these are some of the factors in the big picture. I'm just going to do two slides to finish the presentation. There's a few more that we we haven't got to yet. Next, please. This just shows the a simple program evaluation where you have different components which you evaluate separately, and you then put them together to look at the program outcomes and then to discuss the program impacts. So here you're looking at each of the components individually and saying that you can add those together to get an estimate of the program outcomes. So next, when you look at the complex programs, you have the same boxes going along the top, the findings of the component evaluations, looking at the program outcomes, but you also now bring in all of these other factors, the box at the bottom left, look at emergence and spillover, how coordination affects outcomes, policy coherence, and the 4 dimensions of complexity we're looking at: the interventions, organizational dynamics, causality, and context. So here you're building on the simple evaluation, but looking at all of this wide range of factors which can be affecting the overall outcomes of the program. And these are the things you need to use when you look at the box at the right, when you're trying to assess broader impacts on broader goals like the SDGs. So you can see how the simple evaluation links into the broader evaluation. So I will stop there. There's a few more slides which we can discuss later or in the next session if there's time, but I want to leave time for the discussions. And then Florence, if you can just remind me towards the end of the session, I'll just take 5 minutes to just introduce what we're going to be talking about in the next session, some of the challenges of evaluating the SDGs. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. This has been quite a speeded delivery, but it's been very exciting. So we'll have time for some questions. Most of what Michael had planned to do has been given, even though he raced through it. So we do have some questions on the chat bar, but we're open now for questions that you would like to ask. We would like to hear your voices. We have some time for that. We have 5 minutes? Yeah, we have about five or so minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, you fire away. I realize that some of the questions you had asked after the first session may have been answered by Michael's presentation, but please go ahead and ask your question. Unmute yourself if you can, and then ask your question. Thank you. Michael, there's one question that has come from Pamorat, and the question says, has there been any examples of a real evaluation that follows this approach? And then where can we read them?
Yeah, Michael, this is Ada. I have compiled a few questions that are very straightforward, so I will summarize them very briefly. There is a person saying that the theory of change should capture this complexity. And what do you think about the theory of change capturing the whole dimension of a complex program project? There is another question talking about how can we diminish or avoid the subjectivity when assigning scores. What is the estimate cost of a complexity evaluation? And whether you consider it's worth including the complexity approach in the terms of reference of an evaluation. Thank you. Over.
Some very good questions as always. So thank you very much. In terms of examples of complexity evaluation, the book that I mentioned, Dealing with Complexity in Development Evaluation, there's a section which has about 6 case studies illustrating different approaches to complexity, and one of the chapters is talking about an evaluation of a gender-based violence program in El Salvador, which I was just discussing briefly. So there are some examples there. One of the reasons we wrote the book, it's quite difficult to find examples of complexity evaluations. I'm not saying there aren't any, but one of the challenges is a lot of the complexity specialists tend to write in a very complex theoretical way, very sort of quantitative and mathematical, and it's often difficult to sort of apply some of their approaches in the sort of real world that we work in. So it's quite hard to find many examples. It's very easy to find examples of evaluations where they say they're going to use a complexity evaluation, but very often they don't do that. So I'd be interested in examples which you have from your own work, but the book is one of the reasons we put in those examples was because they're quite hard to find. So there's a few examples there, including several from the Global Environment Facility. People working in environment have done a lot of work on complexity because they tend to have access to the kinds of data from satellites and drones and remote sensors and so on, which makes it easier to do complexity analysis. On the theory of change and complexity, theoretically, you can use a theory of change to address complexity, but in practice, if you look at most theories of change, they tend to be linear. You have a series of straight arrows. You have your inputs, you have your activities, you have the outputs, the outcomes, the impacts, and very often the theory of change is just explaining a linear process. A lot of theories of change hardly include any external contextual factors. They very often don't analyze specifically changes in the political environment or the economic environment or the effect of migration or civil war. Some of them mention it peripherally, but it's often the main focus is of just showing in a linear way how the program will achieve its objectives. So my brief response would be that while theories of change could address complexity, many of them don't, and hopefully they will start to focus more on complexity once you begin to develop these rather simpler ways of measuring it. The question of how to avoid subjectivity in the ratings is a very important question with any kind of rating. So there's various steps, none of which completely resolve the problem, but one of the basic steps is to have at least 2 and ideally 3 people doing the ratings independently. If you just have one person doing the ratings, it's very difficult to know whether this was subjective or not. If you have 2 or 3 people doing this independently and they come with similar scores, you feel a little bit more comfortable. You can also have you can ask them to note down why they gave a score of a low score or a high score. So you can have a column where they write notes and they say, I think this program was complex because there seemed to be quite a lot of disagreement among the different stakeholders about what were the objectives of the program. So you can put in that column as well for people to give their explanation. You can also, if you're going to be investing some time in this, to use the checklist in a particular sector, you can actually come up with a sort of guidelines, and for each of the indicators, you can say this is an example of what would be a low level of complexity of objectives. This is an example of what would be a high level, and so you try to give people examples. But so those are a few of the techniques. When you use checklists for looking at infrastructure projects, I've seen guidelines where you actually include photographs. So when you're rating the quality of road maintenance as being poor, It's a different issue, but it's an illustration where you say road maintenance has been poor. You actually include a photograph saying you can see in this photograph there are lots of cracks in the road, there are weeds growing through the cracks. This is something we would consider poor maintenance. And then you have another photograph, this would be good maintenance, where you see the road is in good condition. So there's a number of things like that. But one of the key factors is really spending a lot of time thinking about what are the indicators that you want to measure. This example I've given you would just put together fairly quickly to illustrate the ideas, but you'd spend quite a lot of time thinking what are the indicators and how you would measure. So it's like developing any other kind of rating scale or an attitude scale. You need to put in quite a bit of time measuring, testing, and changing. So those are a few of the factors. The final question on the cost of a complexity evaluation, there isn't any sort of standard of cost. In some cases, the cost could be considerable if you're collecting a lot more data and if you're spending a lot more time visiting the projects. But in other cases, it doesn't have to be very much. You can see if you unpack the program and you do evaluations of the individual components, the cost of doing the component evaluations is pretty similar to what you would do in any conventional evaluation. You'd have to spend some time and resources on doing the systems analysis at the beginning. That can be done as simply as the chart I showed you with the example from the Ministry of Transport, or a systems analysis can be very complicated and expensive. So as with any other evaluation, there's a big range of costs. And so you can, in a lot of cases, you can do a complexity analysis without too much of an increase in costs. Now, the exciting thing, which I didn't have time to get through to, but I have some slides, is it's now becoming possible to start using big data, satellite images, social media analysis of Twitter to find out people's attitudes to a program, the kinds of data you can get from cell phones. If you are able to use these new information technologies, you can collect a lot more information at a lower cost. So it becomes possible to do a fairly sophisticated complexity-focused evaluation without necessarily increasing very much the cost. So the message is that even if you have a relatively small budget, you can introduce the basic principles of complexity evaluation without having to spend too much. But if you have a very large program, if it's a World Bank program of $50 million, which is covering schools throughout the 2 or 3 states in India, obviously that's a much larger and a more expensive initiative. So there's no sort of standard rule of what it's going to cost, but it's the same as with, if somebody asks you, is your evaluation going to be expensive or cheap? You say it depends. If you only have a small amount of money, you can do a much cheaper evaluation. If you have more money and the need, you can spend a lot more money. So it's rather similar with complexity analysis, but the message is it doesn't have to be super expensive. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. There's a few more questions, but we don't have a lot of time to do that. I just have to ask one. And Anu is thanking you for for citing the examples on some of the work that they have done in the GEF. And Lars is asking, and I don't know if you can see, or you probably can see it. He says that when he worked at the bank, they developed and used especially two tools, social assessment and stakeholder analysis. How do you assess them relative to what you are now talking about?
Okay.
A very quick response from you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. they're both very useful tools. The stakeholder analysis can be very helpful for complexity analysis, although you'd need to focus it a little bit, because a lot of stakeholder analysis is basically asking people what are the kinds of information that they want about a project. And if you're using it to understand the complexities of the relationships between different stakeholders, you probably want to dig a little bit deeper to ask people what they think are the key outcomes of the program. How well you could almost go through some parts of the checklist, asking them whether they think the program objectives are clearly defined, or whether they think that there's a lot of different objectives. So you need to dig a little bit deeper. You don't just want to know what each stakeholder would like you to find out. You also need to understand a little bit about the relationships between the stakeholders and their perceptions of the different parts of the program. For example, if you ask several stakeholders what they think of the objectives of the program, and if they all disagreed on what the objectives were, that might be an indicator that the objectives are relatively complex. So that's something to dig a bit deeper. But stakeholder analysis is a useful tool. The different kinds of social analysis are very important for complexity, and it's a good example of, there's a lot of tools which are already available which you can draw on for complexity analysis. You don't just have to go and invent everything completely new. So there's a whole literature on the different kinds of social analysis, and there's certainly things which you could use. And I'm sure lots of you will have other checklists and tools which you were thinking, well, this could fit into a complexity analysis. So always try to begin with what you already have, rather than trying to dig new things. So just one quick point on the stakeholder analysis. One of the sensitive things which you often don't study is the relationships between stakeholders. Often there's a certain amount of competition between the stakeholders about who's going to be running the project. Each of them may have a different way that they want the project to be monitored. So one of the things you'd like to try to capture is the relationships between stakeholders. Is there a high level of agreement and cooperation among stakeholders? Is there competition? Is there just disagreement? Because this is often a very key factor in understanding complexity. You may have a program which is, for example, the school feeding program. The program itself may be relatively simple, but if you have a lot of different stakeholders wanting to use the program in different ways, monitoring it in different ways, maybe targeting, one of them wants to include indigenous populations, another one doesn't, you may find that one of the biggest elements of complexity is these disagreements between stakeholders. So you want to dig a little bit into that, and that can be sensitive sometimes. Your client may not want you to be talking about how UNDP gets on with the Asian Development Bank or with the World Bank. So that can be a little bit sensitive, but it's often one of the very important elements of complexity you need to understand. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. We shall continue now, and you have, you said you had a very few set of slides to conclude the section. You want to do that now, please?
Yes, so I can do. In fact, if you could just go to the very final slide. It's the part 5 is complexity challenges in SDG evaluations. That's right at the end, and then so just show that heading, and then just go on to the final slide, which is complexity challenges in SDG evaluations. Have you found that?
Yes, we are on that slide.
Great, thank you. So this is just to whet your appetites for the next webinar. This is like the trailer for the movie coming next week. So this is just mentioning that some of the aspects of the SDGs which provide complexity challenges, and these are the things we're going to be talking about in the next session, how we can apply the approach which we've been discussing to understand the SDGs. So a few of the elements of the SDGs which lead to complexity. Firstly, many of them are multi-sectoral, or they overlap. For example, there are specific SDG objectives for gender and women's empowerment, but there are also those are affected by, for example, transport or education or employment generation, all affect women's empowerment. So any of the poverty, whatever you're looking at, you need to look at the effects of interventions in different sectors. So you need a multi-sectoral analysis, which is very challenging to do. Most conventional evaluations have difficulties with that. Then there's also huge numbers of stakeholders in many of the SDGs, the international agencies, the government, the local government agencies, civil society, academia. So many different stakeholders all interacting with each other, which again complicates the evaluation. Emergence and non-linearity are very important. All of the SDG programs change, particularly if we're thinking of a 15-year time horizon. So we get into all of these challenges of emergence and non-linear change, which we need to address. Then many of the SDGs are trying to promote behavioral and organizational change. Behavioral change is the things like you provide water, but different communities have different practices, sanitation practices, how they use water, how they keep it clean, whether they boil it. And so these behavioral changes or affecting nutrition or affecting any kind of program you're looking at are difficult to measure. They're very dynamic and often quite subtle. And again, the organizational changes of how different agencies use the new services or deliver them. So again, those processes are very complex. And then there's programs which are operating at the national level or in a particular region. The whole context is continually changing. If you just think of any of the countries you work in, the changes which are going to be happening over the next 5, 10, 15 years, there may be increases or decreases in violence, civil war, conflict. You may have massive migration. You may have drought. You may have a completely different government system. So all of these factors have a major influence on the programs, need to be evaluated. Then you have the big problem that complexity analysis, you would like to use a number of different data sources which you compare and integrate into your model, but you're working in many countries with very limited ability to collect and to analyze data. So this is a challenge, how to do complexity evaluation or any kind of evaluation when you have limited access to data and limited capacity to analyze it. And then finally, something which often slips off the edge of the radar screen, but which is absolutely critical for the SDGs, are the issues of social exclusion. Many vulnerable groups are not captured in government statistics. And if you look at how many programs are evaluated, there's a very rigorous evaluation of the people who are the beneficiaries of the program, but almost no data on the people who are excluded from the programs. If you look at the educational evaluations, they often just evaluate what is going on in the public schools and maybe some of the private schools, but they tend not to capture what's going on in the informal schools or in some of the small religious schools. So many, if you look at health programs, they do a lot of studies on people who come to the clinic. They have almost no data on people who don't come to the clinic. So these issues of social exclusion, which may be accidental, they may be intentional. As you know, in a lot of European countries, there's lots of governments that are trying to force the Roma people, the gypsies, to leave their country. So there's very intentional exclusion of some groups. So these are some of the many factors which affect and increase the complexity of the SDGs. And so in the next webinar, whenever the organizers decide to offer that, we're going to be talking about how the complexity evaluation methodology can be applied to examining the complex dimensions of the SDGs. So that's what we have to look forward to in the next session. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd like, on behalf of us, to say thank you. But now, having heard the practical suggestions and some of the reactions coming on the sidebar, is the time to listen to Dorothy, to hear her take on what Michael has offered, this menu that Michael has offered. I'd like to welcome Dorothy.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you. Are you here okay? I'm assuming yes. Thank you so much, Michael, for covering a huge amount of material in a very short space of time, and thank you all to the participants for joining us and for the questions on the sidebar. As we move towards the end of the session, my job is just to give a few reflections on what Michael has presented and bring some key points together. And I'm going to do this from the lens of looking at the SDGs and the experience of working in complexity. And there's 4 points I'd like to just highlight from Michael's presentation. The first is about the point that Lars, Guy, I think, and a few others mentioned, that we already have a lot of tools available in evaluation. And I think what Michael was exhorting us to do was not to throw those tools away and view complexity, responsive evaluation, as something different, but rather as something more, and something that enables us to push forward the boundaries of our practice in evaluation, that helps us to focus and that helps us to go deeper into meaning and causality, which then helps us to understand better. So that's an important point for us to take on board. The second point is around being aware of complexity. So the checklist is not about a process for counting and numbers and measurement. It's about where is that complexity occurring. Sometimes I think we confuse complexity with confusion and inability to identify what is really happening. Whereas the tool that Michael was presenting to us was helping us to say, let's be aware of where complexity is really occurring, and let's focus in those areas, and then be responsive, more responsive to those areas. So some of the examples about domestic violence, for instance, focusing in on some of those more opaque areas that aren't normally able to be identified. The third point is around the dimensions, and we've seen a number of points in the chat bar about the dimensions, the 4 dimensions being very useful, and I would very much agree with that, that while there may be some questions around the different sub-dimensions, I think the 4 dimensions are very useful. The only comment I'd have is that dimension number 3 is called causality and change, and yet actually change was mentioned, Michael, across all 4 dimensions, that for each of the dimensions change can occur, and we need to be aware that in complex evaluations we need to pick up on the change that's occurring across all of the 4 dimensions. And then lastly, the 5 steps also are very helpful. Perhaps the most critical point for the SDGs is step number 4, is reassembling the different units in complexity when we look at those, and how when we reassemble to the big picture. For the SDGs, there are synergies and trade-offs, there are certainties and risks, and that looking at when we reassemble to be aware of what does that mean when we reassemble it. A number of the questions were about theory of change, and theory of change again, there are one of the things there that's done is assumptions and risks. So actually understanding the intensity of that is very important in understanding the level of complexity and the big picture in number 5. So these are just very simple reflections, and we very much look forward to the next session. And I was thinking of an illustration of what we're actually talking about here. You talked about mapping, Michael, quite a bit. And if you think of how mapping has changed over the years, we used to use pieces of paper as maps, very two-dimensional. Now we have multi-dimensional maps where we can zoom in and zoom out. We can look at more detail. We can look at more real-time maps. And in a way, our evaluation practice and complexity is doing the same thing, that it enables us to focus in on the detail and understand and look more deeply at what's going on. So thank you to all the participants, and I'll hand you back to Florence.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I would like to, on behalf of Michael, on behalf of the EVAL SDGs, to thank Michael profusely for taking us through this presentation in such a short time, for raising the issues that he has raised, and basically to thank Dorothy for telling us about extracting some of the points, the takeaways from the presentation, and basically in some kind of way, perhaps giving us, in a sense, the idea of some of the principles that are important. What we're saying now is we have a few more minutes for a few last chats. Exactly, we started late, so we've just gone about, we started 20 minutes late, so we could do another 5 minutes of a few discussions and points. And of course, we still have the sidebar. There's been lots of questions about whether the presentation is going to be shared, whether the checklist will be shared. All of that will be shared. And I'd like to remind us again that Michael would like inputs and further conversations with the checklist or on the checklist, not just Michael, UNICEF, and to say to the people who want to ask questions in French, Spanish, or Portuguese that you could pose your questions in those languages, and Michael can respond in English. And finally, to say that for those of us who have had some technical difficulties with joining, we are sorry about that. Michael, I don't know if you can see the pain, but everybody's been going and thanking you for this interesting conversation. We are moving from discussing complexity to a point where we are all, as evaluators, trying to understand how to use some of the tools we currently have. Most of the tools are exciting, but using them in a new way, in a complexity-aware manner. My question, however, to those people who are managers and commissioners of evaluation is, when they commission evaluations and give us tours and suggest methodologies or methods for evaluation, are they complexity aware or complexity responsive? And I know that we started out at 250 participants. We're now down to 180, still not bad. So there must be many commissioners and managers of evaluation out there who are listening to me. And I would like to thank you all again for this conversation. We can continue informally for another 5 minutes if you're interested in staying. I don't know about Michael, but thank you very much for everybody that has joined us. We are very appreciative of Michael. We thank Aga and the team out there that has put this together. And do join us again for the second session in this webinar, which is going to happen, and Ada has promised to send us the information in good enough time for us to participate. Thank you very much, but we'll keep...
Thanks, Florence. Mike, there are two interesting questions there that not from me, this is Ada, but from the participants. One is from one participant that is asking whether complexity can be assessed in a retrospective manner. So when the evaluation has not planned for it, but in the making there are some complex issues that arise, and how can we go retrospectively? And the other interesting comment comes from Jim Rook. He says that he found the checklist interesting. However, he found it a bit ironic, the attempt to simplify the complexity by quantifying into scores. He says, what I think would be most helpful, and yes, complex, would be to consider ways to address each of the dimensions, especially those that the raters feel that they are more critical, to address them during the evaluation. Over. Thank you very much.
Okay. Would you like me to comment briefly?
Yes, please, Michael, since you're still available.
Yeah. Well, thank you. These are very interesting and very challenging questions, all of them, so I hope we can keep the dialogue going. The retrospective complexity analysis is a very interesting idea, and many of the dimensions you could analyze retrospectively. The problem would be that quite a few of the factors you actually need to be looking at the processes of change. Like, for example, if you're looking at behavioral change, it's difficult often to assess that retrospectively. For example, if you ask a woman if how her relationships with her husband have changed because of her getting a micro loan, sometimes she finds it difficult to explain what the changes are. So if you were actually there during the process of her getting involved with the microcredit program, you may observe some of the changes, that she's taking more decisions about the children's education. But if you actually ask her, she'll say, no, it's my husband who understands these things. I don't get involved. So often there's a difference between what people tell you and their observed behavior. So there's a number of things like that which it's difficult to assess retrospectively, but a lot of things you can. And one of the exciting things with the big data is it permits certain kinds of retrospective analysis. For example, if you're using satellite images, you can often get longitudinal data where you can observe, for example, the road structure or the water supply structure before a project began, or the forest cover before a project began. So satellite images allows you to do some kind of retrospective analysis, and increasingly now social media analysis, you can get longitudinal data from Twitter on a particular subject. So sometimes you can go back in time for 1 or 2 years, occasionally more, and see how attitudes are changing or how reported behavior is changing. We all know that analyzing social media can be tricky, but it's beginning to become a new tool for doing retrospective analysis. But as many of the evaluations we do are retrospective, it's really very interesting and important to see to what extent we can build in complexity. So certainly that's an area which is challenging but exciting, and I think there's a lot of things we can do. The different ways that we use the checklist, we can have a lot of discussions about that, and so these were some interesting points of can you look at the dimensions individually, or we also have to remember the interactions between the dimensions. So we need to use, as Dorothy was saying, a complexity-aware framework. But I hope we'll have a very rich discussion on different ways that one could use this checklist, including some of the suggestions from the speaker. But that's an exciting topic to get into, and hopefully we'll continue in the next session.
Well,
thank you very much, Michael. Over to Ada to ask if we can close this officially now.
Yes, yes, Florence. I would like to just remind some points to participants. First, thank you very, very much for you all. We have been here almost 2 hours. This is amazing. Thank you very much to Mike for his contribution, wonderful contribution, and for his willing to do a second webinar on this topic. Thanks very much to Florence and to Dorothy. Florence for her moderation with excellent insights, Dorothy for her critical thinking, very useful inputs, Dorothy. Thank you very, very much. We will announce the date of the second webinar in the coming days. There is still some coordination that we have to do. Therefore, please bear with us. We will announce it as soon as possible. We will, as I have sent in hundreds of emails, we will send all the materials in the coming days. May I ask you to please read your emails, otherwise we have to answer triple the emails that probably it's necessary to answer. We will send all of them. We will set the checklist, and we look forward to receiving your inputs to the checklist. We will compile them. Ada Ocampo for the non-UNICEF people, and Lovemore and Celeste for the UNICEF people. Anyway, we will send the reminders. Thank you very, very much for you all. We will also send the recording of this webinar. And it has been great to have your participation. On behalf of UNICEF and EVAL SDGs, thank you very much, and we look forward to having you in the second part of this webinar. Michael, muchas gracias. Un abrazo.
Bueno, de nada.
Goodbye, everybody. Good evening, good night, good afternoon.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Michael. It was lovely having you.